To understand the architect of history's largest contiguous empire, you must first understand the boy. Before the title of Genghis Khan echoed across the world, there was Temujin. And before Temujin, there was a primal wound, a foundational act of violence that would become the first brutal lesson in an education written in blood and tears. This lesson wasn't learned in a classroom. It was learned from the screams of his own mother. The story of the Mongol Empire doesn't begin with a battle for a throne. It begins with an abduction. His mother, Holun, was a young bride of the Merkit tribe, traveling home with her new husband. They were not at war. They were simply living, breathing, existing in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the steppes. But on the steppes, existence itself is a state of perpetual risk. From over a ridge, another man, a minor tribal chief named Yasuge, saw her. And in the brutal calculus of this world, to see was to desire, and to desire was to take. There was no courtship. There was only the thunder of hooves, the terror in a young woman's eyes, and the finality of being ripped from one life and thrown into another. Yasuge and his brothers charged, and Haolun's husband, hopelessly outnumbered, fled for his life. Her only act of defiance was to take off her tunic and throw it to him as he galloped away, a desperate plea for him never to forget her scent, never to forget her existence. He never saw her again. She was now the property of Yasuge, and the son she would eventually bear him, the boy, who would be named Temujin, was born directly from this act of violent possession. He was, from his first breath, the product of a bride kidnapping. Think about that. The man who would redraw the map of the world was conceived in the shadow of a tradition where women were not partners to be won, but resources to be seized. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the grim rhythm of life on the steppes, and this single event, the foundation of his own family, would become a poisoned seed, planting a truth deep within his mind. That power, in its most elemental form, was the ability to take and to hold. But what he could not have known was that this cycle of violence, the very act that gave him life, was a debt that would one day be repaid in the most agonizing way imaginable. History has a horrifying sense of symmetry. Decades later, Temujin, now a young man trying to carve out his own place in the world, had just married his own bride, Berthe. She was his first and, by all accounts, his only true love, the anchor in the storm of his early life. For a brief moment, there was a fragile peace. But the ghosts of the past never sleep. The Merkits, the tribe from which his mother had been stolen, had not forgotten. For them, a debt of honor had been left unpaid for a generation, and that debt was about to be collected. One night, under the cover of darkness, the Merkits attacked Temujin's small camp. The sound of hooves that had once heralded his father's victory now heralded his own profound humiliation. He was powerless, outnumbered, and forced to flee, hiding in the mountains as he heard the screams from his own camp. He escaped with his life, but he lost everything else. His wife, Berthe, was gone, captured, stolen, taken by the very people his father had wronged. This was not just a loss, it was a shattering. The future universal ruler, the scourge of God, was, in that moment, a helpless man whose wife had become a spoil of war. This singular event seared itself into his soul. The shame, the incandescent fury, the utter impotence. It was a psychological poison that would curdle into a cold, unyielding resolve. This personal humiliation would not be forgotten. It would be magnified 1,000,000 times over and projected onto the world stage. It would become the unwritten justification for the subjugation of nations. The pain of one man was about to become the pain of millions. For 9 agonizing months, Berthe was a captive of the Merkits. She was given to one of their warriors as a wife, subjected to the same fate as Temujin's mother. When Temujin, with the help of powerful allies, finally mustered the strength to attack the Merkits and rescue her, he found her pregnant. The son she bore shortly after, Yochi, would forever live under a cloud of suspicion. The name Yochi itself means guest in Mongolian, a permanent public acknowledgement of his uncertain paternity. Was he Temujin's biological son, conceived before the kidnapping, or was he the son of a Merkit rapist? The question was never answered. And this ambiguity, this constant visible reminder of his wife's violation and his own initial weakness, became another layer of the wound. Yoshi was a living symbol of his greatest failure. This deep-seated anxiety over bloodlines, over legitimacy, would fester and later manifest in his imperial policy, absolute certainty for his own lineage, and the systematic annihilation of the lineages of his enemies. It is easy, from the comfort of the modern world, to dismiss bride kidnapping as an act of pure, chaotic savagery. But to do so is to misunderstand the brutal logic of the 12th century Mongolian steppe. This was not a world of abundance. It was a world of scarcity, where tribes fought endlessly over grazing lands, water, and the most precious resource of all, people. In this unforgiving environment, a woman's fertility was not a private matter. It was a strategic asset, the engine of a tribe's future. To steal a woman was an act of economic and genetic warfare. You didn't just gain a wife, you stole the enemy's ability to reproduce. You deprived them of future warriors, future mothers. You asserted your dominance not just on the battlefield, but in the blood itself. Every child born from that union was a victory for your tribe and a permanent loss for theirs. It was a way to absorb and weaken your rivals, a cold calculus of survival where human lives were, tallied like livestock. Furthermore, it was the ultimate act of psychological warfare. It was a message, sent with brutal clarity, that you were so powerful you could not only defeat your enemy's warriors, but you could also seize the source of their lineage. It shattered their morale, dishonored their men, and broke the fundamental structure of their society. It was a terror tactic designed to ensure that even if a tribe survived a raid, it would be crippled for a generation. Kindness was a luxury the steppes could not afford. Mercy was a fatal weakness. The only language understood was that of overwhelming, crushing force. This was the classroom of Temujin's youth. His father was his first teacher. His own trauma was his final exam. He didn't just learn that the world was cruel. He learned how it was cruel. He learned that controlling women was synonymous with controlling the future. He saw, firsthand, how the seizure of a single woman could define the fate of men and tribes for decades. These were not abstract concepts to him. They were visceral, personal truths, carved into his memory with the sharp edge of shame and the burning fire of revenge. This formative education in violence is the key. It is the Rosetta Stone for deciphering the man who would become Genghis Khan. The brutal traditions of the steppes were not something he would later reject in favor of a more civilized form of rule. Instead, he would take these raw, chaotic practices and refine them. He would systematize them, scale them up, and turn them from the desperate acts of warring tribes into the calculated, terrifyingly efficient policy of a global empire. He learned his lessons on the unforgiving anvil of personal suffering. Soon, he would be the one holding the hammer. When Temujin, through sheer force of will and strategic genius, finally united the warring Mongol tribes in 1206, he was no longer just a tribal chief. He was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. And a universal ruler needs a universal law. He needed a way to transform the chaotic, blood-feuding culture of the steppes into the disciplined, unified engine of an empire. The instrument he created for this transformation was the Yasa. The Yasa, or the Great Law, has become a thing of legend. No complete original version survives. It has come down to us in fragments, quoted in the histories of Persian, Chinese, and European chroniclers who were both fascinated and terrified by the Mongol machine. On the surface, the Yasa was a code of absolute order. It prescribed death for a dizzying array of offenses: theft, adultery, cowardice in battle, urinating in a river, even a traveler failing to share his food with another. It demanded absolute loyalty to the Khan and imposed a rigid social structure that bound the new Mongol nation together with chains of iron discipline. For the Mongols themselves, it was a social contract written in blood, but it is in the unspoken, in the deliberate omissions, and the stark contrasts of the Yasa that its true, terrifying genius is revealed. The law's primary function was not to create universal justice. It was to create a razor-sharp legal distinction between two classes of humanity, the Mongols and everyone else. It was a legal framework for conquest, and within that framework, sex and reproduction became officially sanctioned instruments of state policy. The Yasa's brutal paradox was its core strength. Within the Mongol world, it created an almost puritanical order. Outside of it, it unleashed and legitimized a hellscape of sexual violence. Consider the law against adultery. For a Mongol man or woman, to commit adultery was to invite certain death. The punishment was absolute, with no room for appeal. Why? Because within the nascent empire, stable family units and clear bloodlines were paramount. The Khan needed to know precisely who his subjects were, who their fathers were, and to whom their loyalty belonged. Uncontrolled sexuality within the tribe created chaos, blood feuds, and questions of inheritance, the very things that had plagued the steppes for centuries, and the very things the Yasa was designed to stamp out. It was a matter of internal security, ensuring the genetic and social integrity of the conquering people. But this strict moral code vanished the moment a Mongol warrior crossed the border into enemy territory. For the conquered, the Yasa offered no such protections. In fact, it explicitly defined their bodies as spoils of war. The Persian historian Atamalik Juvaini, who served the Mongol Ilkhans and had access to their traditions, tells us that the women and children of a defeated enemy were considered oljo, booty, plunder, property to be divided. This wasn't just the unspoken custom of a victorious army, it was a legally enshrined right. The Great Law that forbade a Mongol from touching his neighbor's wife simultaneously gave him a legal mandate to seize the wife of any man who stood against the Khan. This legal framework transformed rape from a random act of wartime brutality into a systematic administrative process. It was no longer a crime of passion. It was the orderly distribution of assets. After a city was taken and its male population was either slaughtered or enslaved, a chillingly bureaucratic process would begin. The women who survived the initial massacre were rounded up, herded into compounds, and subjected to an appraisal. This was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a top-down system of selection, a human auction where the currency was power and rank. At the very top of this pyramid of human misery were the most prized captives. The princesses of defeated kingdoms, the wives and daughters of sultans and kings, and women renowned for their extraordinary beauty were reserved for the Khan himself and his immediate family. These were not just sexual conquests, they were political symbols. To take the queen of a conquered nation into your own harem was the ultimate expression of dominance. It was a public declaration that you had not only broken their army, but you had also seized their very lineage. These women, like the legendary Khwarezmian Princess Turkan Khatun, were living trophies, their presence in the Khan's camp a constant reminder to the world of his supreme power. The next tier of this grim selection belonged to the elite of the Mongol army. The generals, the commanders of a tumen, a unit of 10,000 men, and warriors who had distinguished themselves with exceptional bravery were rewarded with their pick of the remaining high-value women. This was a powerful incentive, a tangible reward for loyalty and ferocity in battle. It created a system where military prowess was directly linked to sexual reward. It told every soldier that the path to acquiring women and establishing a larger family was through unwavering service to the Khan and unrestrained violence against his enemies. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of conquest, where the spoils of one war became the motivation for the next. Finally, what remained was distributed among the common soldiers or, in many cases, simply cast aside. Women who were not deemed beautiful enough for the elite, or who were older, were often relegated to the status of camp followers, servants, or slaves. They were put to work, used for manual labor, or sold in the vast slave markets that flourished in the wake of the Mongol conquests. Their fate was often a slow, anonymous death, their names and stories erased from history, their only legacy being the children of their violators. This entire process, from selection to distribution, was the Yasa in action. Genghis Khan, the master strategist, understood a fundamental truth about human motivation. He knew that an army fights not just for a cause, but for reward. And he institutionalized the most primal reward of all. He transformed the bodies of conquered women into a currency of the state. He could pay his soldiers, reward his generals, and consolidate his own power without spending a single coin. He was paying them with the lives, the dignity, and the genetic future of his enemies. This is the true, dark heart of the Great Law. It wasn't just a set of rules, it was the architectural blueprint for a reproductive empire. On one hand, it built a protective wall around the Mongol gene pool, ensuring its purity and stability. On the other hand, it created a legal and moral void into which the women of all other nations could be thrown. It was a declaration that Mongol life and lineage were sacred, and all other life was a resource to be exploited. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror of land and cities. He was an architect of sexual dominion, and the Yasa was his master plan, written not on paper, but on the bodies of the conquered. To speak of rape in the context of the Mongol Empire is to speak of a strategy, not a sin. Within the cold, pragmatic framework of Genghis Khan's grand design, sexual violence was honed into a precision instrument of war. It was a tool with multiple, devastating functions, each one calculated to dismantle an enemy society from the inside out. It was a weapon that attacked not just the bodies of the living, but the very soul of a culture and the bloodlines of its future. The horror was not in its chaos, but in its chillingly logical application. The first function was psychological. It was an instrument of pure, unadulterated terror. The Mongol army was a master of psychological warfare, and the systematic rape of captured women was one of its most effective tactics. The fate of a city that resisted was made into a terrifying public spectacle. After the walls were breached and the men were put to the sword, the women were dragged from their homes into the streets and subjected to mass violation. This was often done in full view of their surviving relatives, fathers and sons who were being marched into slavery. It was an act of ultimate humiliation, designed to communicate a message of absolute and total subjugation. This was not a secret, it was a promise. The stories of what happened to the women of Samarkand, of Bukhara, of Nishapur, were deliberately allowed to spread. Mongol scouts and traders, intentionally or not, became heralds of this unspeakable horror. The news would travel faster than the army itself, carried on the winds of panic. For the next city in the Khan's path, the choice became stark. Surrender unconditionally, or watch your wives and daughters suffer a fate many considered worse than death. How many city gates were thrown open not by the force of a battering ram, but by the paralyzing fear of this specific threat? Rape, in this context, was a siege weapon. It was used to break the will to resist before the first arrow was even fired. It turned the love a man had for his family into a vulnerability the Mongols could exploit, making surrender seem like the only compassionate option. The second, and perhaps most profound function of this strategy was genetic. It was a deliberate act of biological and cultural annihilation. This was not simply about sating the lust of a conquering army. It was about actively rewriting the future of a conquered people. Every child born from these mass rapes was a genetic foothold for the Mongol Empire. A child born to a Persian, Khwarezmian, or Kievan Rus's mother, but fathered by a Mongol warrior, was a living symbol of the conquest. They would grow up in a shattered society, a permanent reminder of their people's defeat. This was a long-term strategy of demographic replacement. In a single generation, the ethnic and genetic makeup of a region could be irrevocably altered. The old bloodlines, the lineages of local kings and chieftains that had existed for centuries, were diluted and, in many cases, erased. The future of the land was now seeded with the conqueror's DNA. This wasn't just conquest, it was colonization at the most fundamental biological level. You don't need to build fortresses and cities if you can simply replace the population with your own offspring. The children born of these unions were often caught in a cultural limbo, not fully accepted by the maternal society they represented, yet a part of the new ruling order. They became an unwitting and often unwilling foundation for Mongol rule in the conquered territories. Consider the scale. When a city of 50,000 people was taken, and its male population decimated, even a few thousand Mongol soldiers could impregnate a significant percentage of the surviving women. It was a mathematical formula for cultural erasure. You remove the men, the protectors and propagators of the old culture. You then impregnate the women, the vessels of the new culture. Within a generation, you have a new population that is biologically tied to the conqueror. This is the pinnacle of the genetic architect vision, a world where the borders of the empire are not just drawn on maps, but are etched into the very DNA of humanity. The third function was the systematic destruction of social fabric. A society is more than just a collection of people. It's a web of relationships, of family ties, of honor, and of shared identity. The Mongol strategy of mass rape was designed to shred this web to pieces. For the men who survived, the psychological trauma of witnessing the violation of their female relatives was a wound that would never heal. It instilled a sense of profound powerlessness and emasculation. The core unit of society, the family, was broken. How could a husband look at his wife without remembering her trauma? How could a society look at the children born from these acts without seeing the faces of their conquerors? It created a legacy of shame and division that could poison a culture for generations. It sowed distrust and resentment. It broke the bonds of community. A people who have been so deeply dishonored are a people who are less likely to unite and rebel. It was a form of social engineering, as brutal as it was effective. By attacking the women, Genghis Khan wasn't just attacking individuals, he was attacking the ligaments that held an entire society together. A city can be rebuilt, but a broken culture, a shattered sense of identity, is far more difficult to mend. This is the horrifying genius of the Khan's strategy. He understood that a true conquest is not complete until you have vanquished an enemy's future. By weaponizing rape, he attacked his enemies on all fronts simultaneously. He terrorized them into submission psychologically. He replaced them demographically, seeding their lands with his own blood. And he shattered them socially, ensuring that even if they survived, they would be too broken to ever truly challenge his rule again. The stories from this period are the stuff of nightmares. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing from within the Mongol court, speaks of the riverbeds running red with blood and the air thick with the lamentations of the violated. In the Secret History of the Mongols, the foundational text of Mongol history, the language is often blunt and unsentimental. Conquest is followed by the taking of women as a matter of course. It is presented not as an atrocity, but as a logistical outcome of victory. This cold, matter-of-fact tone is perhaps the most chilling evidence of all. It shows how deeply this practice was embedded, how completely it was normalized within the Mongol worldview. It was not an unfortunate byproduct of war. It was the business of war itself. It was the ultimate expression of power, a horrifyingly effective tool for building an empire designed to last for 1,000 years, not just on the land, but in the blood. Violence was the primary engine of the Mongol Empire, but it was not the only one. Genghis Khan was a master of overwhelming force, but he was also a profoundly cunning political strategist. He understood that while terror could conquer a kingdom, it could not always efficiently govern it. For the nations on the periphery of his empire, the ones he preferred to absorb rather than annihilate, he employed a different, more insidious tool. He turned from the iron fist of sexual conquest to the velvet glove of strategic marriage. But this was no gesture of diplomacy or peace. It was simply a different form of domination, a quieter, slower, but equally lethal method of erasing a nation's sovereignty. It was conquest by matrimony, a ghoulish political theater where the Khan's own daughters became his most effective generals. The policy was simple in its design and brilliant in its execution. For the rulers of kingdoms that bordered his expanding empire, peoples like the Uyghurs, the Karluks, and the Ongud, who were wise enough to submit to his authority without a fight, the Khan offered a unique and seemingly great honor. He would bind their kingdoms to his through marriage. The local king would be granted the privilege of marrying one of Genghis Khan's daughters. In the complex world of tribal politics, such a marriage was the ultimate symbol of alliance and prestige. To become the son-in-law, Gurgen, of the great Khan was to be elevated, protected, and brought into the inner circle of the most powerful man in the world. It was an offer that was impossible to refuse, but this honor came with a series of deadly conditions, clauses written in invisible ink. The first condition was one of absolute exclusivity. The allied king was required to dismiss all of his other wives and consorts. The Mongol princess was not to be merely one of many queens, she was to be the only queen. This immediately achieved two strategic objectives. First, it placed the Khan's daughter at the apex of the allied court's power structure. She held unparalleled influence, and her loyalty was, of course, to her father and her homeland. She became her father's eyes and ears, a permanent Mongol envoy at the very heart of the kingdom. Second, and, more importantly, it ensured that the only legitimate heirs to the throne would be her children who would be the Khan's own grandchildren. It was a guarantee that within a single generation, the ruling blood of the allied kingdom would be Mongol blood. The second condition was even more sinister. Once the marriage was complete, the new son-in-law was expected to prove his loyalty in the most tangible way possible, through military service. He would be called upon to contribute his kingdom's armies to the Mongol war machine, and was often required to lead them personally on the front lines. This was framed as a great honor, the chance to ride alongside the legendary Mongol hordes and share in the spoils of their victories. In reality, it was a death sentence. These allied kings and their troops were consistently placed in the most dangerous positions in battle, used as vanguard forces to absorb the initial shock of an enemy attack, or sent on the most grueling campaigns in the harshest terrains. The attrition rate for the Khan's sons-in-law was astonishingly high. It is a matter of historical record that a significant number of them died in battle. But for the Khan, this was not a tragic loss. It was the intended outcome of the entire strategy. It was a feature, not a bug. Because the moment her husband, the king, fell in battle, the Khan's daughter, the widowed queen, would assume control of the kingdom as regent for her young son, the Khan's grandson. And just like that, the trap was sprung. The allied kingdom, without a single Mongol soldier needing to invade its borders, was now effectively a province of the Mongol Empire. It was governed by the Khan's own daughter, and its future king was his own grandson. The kingdom's independence had been hollowed out from the inside. Its sovereignty surrendered not on a battlefield, but in a marriage bed. It was a slow, patient, and utterly ruthless form of annexation. The silken leash of marriage had become a hangman's noose for an entire nation. The daughters of the Khan were not passive pawns in this grand game. They were raised in a culture of power and political intrigue. They understood their role and, in many cases, executed it with the same ruthlessness as their father. They were formidable women, governing their late husband's territories with an iron will, ensuring that the resources, soldiers, and tribute of the land flowed seamlessly into the Mongol imperial treasury. They became the matriarchs of a new, Mongol-descended aristocracy, presiding over the slow death of the native culture and its replacement with their own. This strategy was so successful that it became standard imperial policy, continued by Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons after his death. The number of kingdoms absorbed through this method is significant. It allowed the Mongols to secure their vast borders, creating a buffer zone of compliant vassal states without the enormous cost of a full-scale military occupation. It was a testament to the Khan's multifaceted genius. He recognized that there was more than one way to conquer a nation. You could shatter it with overwhelming force, erasing its men and replacing its bloodline through rape. Or you could seduce it into submission, offering the illusion of alliance while slowly poisoning its royal lineage and seizing control from within. Both methods, the brutal and the subtle, served the same ultimate purpose and stemmed from the same core belief that had been forged in his youth on the steppes. True, lasting power comes from the control of reproduction. Whether it was seizing the wives of his enemies or strategically deploying his own daughters, the goal was the same. It was to ensure that the future belonged to his blood. It was the ultimate long game, a vision of empire building where the wombs of women, both his enemies and his own, were the most crucial battlefields. It was a terrifyingly intimate form of conquest, proving that the soft whisper of a political marriage could be just as devastating as the roar of 1,000 charging horsemen. So, we return to the ghost in our genes, the shadow of a 12th century warlord still lingering in the DNA of millions of men today. This is the ultimate, chilling testament to the success of Genghis Khan's grand design. His empire of land, the largest the world had ever seen, eventually fractured and fell. His cities have crumbled to dust, but his other empire, the one he built in blood and bone, endures. It is an invisible empire, written in a biological code, and it is perhaps the most permanent conquest in human history. Let us assemble the pieces of this terrifying blueprint. The architecture of his genetic empire was built on 4 cornerstones. It began with the brutal traditions of the steppes, where bride kidnapping was a lesson in survival, teaching a young Temujin that the control of women was the control of the future. This raw, chaotic violence was then codified and legitimized in the Great Yasa, which created a legal framework that protected the sanctity of the Mongol bloodline, while explicitly defining the women of conquered nations as the spoils of war. This law, in turn, unleashed rape not as a random act of brutality, but as a calculated weapon of terror and cultural genocide, a tool to shatter an enemy's morale and systematically overwrite their lineage. And finally, for those he chose to subjugate with subtlety, he perfected the art of strategic marriage, using his own daughters as political pawns, assassins to annex entire kingdoms without a fight. Each component, personal trauma, state law, military strategy, and political intrigue, was a perfectly interlocking part of a single, terrifying machine. A machine designed for one purpose: to ensure the absolute and perpetual dominion of his lineage. It was a vision of conquest so total that it went beyond the subjugation of people to the subjugation of the future itself. The true legacy of Genghis Khan is not the Silk Road, nor is it the Pax Mongolica that briefly united East and West. His true legacy is a horrifying lesson in the ultimate ambition of power. He demonstrated that the most ruthless conqueror does not merely take your land, burn your cities, or steal your wealth. The most ruthless conqueror takes your future. They erase your bloodline and replace it with their own. They ensure that even centuries after their death, the world is still being repopulated by their descendants, while yours fade into a genetic memory. This is not just a story about the distant, savage past. The weaponization of sexual violence is not a relic of the 13th century. It remains one of the darkest and most persistent tools in the playbook of modern warfare and ethnic conflict. From the comfort women of Imperial Japan to the genocidal rapes in Rwanda and Bosnia, and to the ongoing atrocities committed by extremist groups today, the goal remains hauntingly the same: to terrorize, to humiliate, and to destroy a people by attacking the source of their continuity. The battlefield may change, the weapons may evolve, but the fundamental horror of using human bodies as instruments of war endures. The story of Genghis Khan is a cold, stark warning about the absolute extremity of human ambition. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is shaped not just by politics and economics, but by the most primal forces of biology. To truly understand the conflicts of our own time, to grasp the deep-seated hatreds that fuel ethnic cleansing and generational wars, we must have the courage to look into the darkest blueprints of the past. We must understand how a conqueror's desire for immortality can become a death sentence for the identity of millions. If you believe that history must be remembered, not to glorify the conqueror but to warn the future, then join us in this mission to unearth these buried truths. Forgetting enables repetition, but remembering is the first act of prevention.